Okay, I'm making this short video for Jim Browning. I'm trying to help him see that DNA is a code. He doesn't want to believe me when I tell him that DNA is a code. So I'm gonna provide him with this evidence that DNA is a code. It will be an atheist that will explain to him exactly why DNA is a code, just like our computer code. Hopefully his eyes open and see that it's just like our computer code. And then hopefully after realizing that DNA is a code, hopefully he will realize that there must be a creator. But his biases are huge, so that's probably not going to happen.
Show you what I'm up to, what I do. I do speaking events, but mostly what I do is I create teaching materials for use in the classroom. And so I've got a YouTube channel, Stated Clearly, and I've also got a website, statedclearly.com, where those animations can be found. And they're used in high school and sometimes college classrooms for, introductions to genetics, evolution, and chemistry. And then I've got a second channel, Stated Casually, where I do lectures. And so over there, I've got one on signaling theory, which is how it is that communication systems, encoding, decoding systems, like we're going to learn about today, actually evolve naturally. This is a really well-studied area of research, signaling theory. And I've got a whole lecture over there that talks about that. I'm not sure if we're going to get much into the origin of the genetic code, but we will be talking about, that the genetic code really is an encoding system. I've worked recently with the Center for Chemical Evolution. I've been doing animations with them every year. They are researching the origin of life. They haven't focused a whole lot on the origin of the genetic code. That's kind of like later on in the development of life than what they were researching. But geneticists and people in origin of life chemistry, they all consider the genetic code to be code because it allows us, well, because it really does act like code, as we'll see today, but it also allows us to use information theory, all the mathematics from computing to analyze the genetic code. And that's important in biology. So the question today really that I want to be talking about is, does the genetic code work like character or control encoding in machine language? So the zeros and ones in a computer are nucleotides inside of codons. Do they behave in a similar way? And the best way to do this is to just explain briefly how the genetic code works and briefly how computer code works. And really, I mean, I guess the audience will decide whether or not they're similar or not. But in molecular genetics, there are two main types of genes. You've got RNA template genes that do not use the genetic code. They simply are templates for functional chains of RNA. So the ribosome, for example, which is a major important molecule in our bodies, in our cells, it's mostly made of RNA. And so there are genes that are just templates for it. So in DNA, there's a template for an RNA that ends up becoming the ribosome. And then you have protein coding genes, and these genes actually make use of the genetic code, this thing that we call the genetic code, which is right here. Now, when people say that there's code in DNA or that DNA has a language, they're almost always talking about this thing right here, the genetic code. This on the left, I have the classic chart that contains the genetic code that you'd see in a textbook. And on the right, I've just drawn the same thing or outline the same thing vertically so we can easily compare it to multiple different other types of code later on in this presentation. So on the left is what you typically see in a book. On the right is what you'll be seeing a lot in this discussion. Here we have machine code. This is ASCII. Modern computers use, most of them use a variation of this. They don't still use ASCII, but this was used, back in the 60s when the genetic code was first decoded. This is what a lot of people were using in their computers. And again, it's just a slight variation of this that's used now. But you have a series of letters. If you've got a typewriter, for example, so A, B, C, D, that are encoded into zeros and ones that the machine can understand. And then you also have controls like delete, which are encoded in a way that the machine can understand in ones in this case. So here's the genetic code side by side with ASCII. Now, the functional bits inside of a cell are mostly made of protein. Here I've got a little cartoon of hemoglobin, and each little glob inside the hemoglobin is an amino acid. And the protein is a three-dimensional structure made out of amino acids. And so you've got a bunch of different amino acids. There's 20 of them in humans, and they're stuck together head to tail into chains which fold up into three-dimensional shapes. And those three-dimensional shapes are the proteins. And according to the different shape that protein happens to have, it's going to have a different function. Hemoglobin's function is to grab onto oxygen molecules and release those when the blood cell that's carrying the hemoglobin passes nearby oxygen-starved tissue. But there's thousands of types of proteins, and they're all shaped differently because they're made out of different amino acids. Their sequence of amino acids is different. They've folded up into different three-dimensional shapes, and those shapes determine their function. The amino acids that I've drawn here is these little colored squiggly balls and stuff. They're actually molecules. So here is aspartic acid. Aspartic acid is one of the 20 amino acids that we use in our bodies. And you can see here that oxygen atoms are red, carbon is gray, hydrogen is white, and so on. So they're just molecules. And in the genetic code, the three-letter with the lowercase, the little abbreviated things, those are just abbreviations for the name of each amino acid. So aspartic acid is ASP in the genetic code. But that's all it's representing. So in your body, amino acids make up proteins, proteins make up cells, cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, and that makes up you. So the DNA does a lot of different things, but one of its most important functions is to tell ribosomes how to build specific proteins inside the cell. And so you've got your DNA in the nucleus of the cell, and it's made out of nucleotides. There's 4 different types of DNA nucleotides: thymine, cytosine, adenine, and guanine. And then there are enzymes that, so that's where the genetic information is stored. It's in DNA. They don't actually have little letters on them. Obviously, they're just molecules. But inside the nucleus is where the DNA is stored, and it can't really do much in there. It's stored in there. And little enzymes run along the DNA and make copies of it. They make messenger RNA strands of single-sided RNA, which is a molecule very similar to DNA. And that has mostly the same bases in it. It's got uracil in there, which is different than DNA. But that goes out into the cytoplasm of the cell, where it eventually meets up with a ribosome. But what I want to drive home here is that these nucleotides, they are also just molecules. So amino acids are molecules. The nucleotides are also molecules. Every 3 nucleotides makes what we call a codon. And so here we have a GGG codon, and it's a guanine, guanine, guanine. So if I show you the actual 3D molecules here, that's what it would look like. That's what that codon looks like. But the whole chain is split up into chunks of 3 that the ribosome can read. So a chain of RNA goes out of the nucleus into the mouth of a ribosome, which clamps down on it, and it reads it 3 nucleotides at a time, so 1 codon at a time, and it uses that to build the protein chain, which then folds up into its 3-dimensional shape. And every 3 letters, every 3 nucleotides in the chain of RNA, those act as a symbol for a specific amino acid. So it tells the ribosome, grab this specific amino acid out of solution and add it to the growing chain. And physically what's happening there is transfer RNA is attracted. It's got an anticodon and it's attracted to the codon and so on. But essentially what's happening is the ribosome is getting instructions from the RNA telling it how to build a protein. What type of amino acid should it add to the growing chain next? And the RNA tape, it goes through the ribosome, it moves through it, and every time 3 new nucleotides are hit, the ribosome grabs another amino acid, and that's how this process works. So, I said that the codon is a symbol for an amino acid, Cambridge Dictionary, a symbol is a sign, shape, or object that is used to represent something else. It's very important to realize here that the nucleotides, the codons, are not turned into amino acids. They represent amino acids. The ribosome and the tRNAs that work with the ribosome are structured in such a way that they read the RNA and they treat each codon as a symbol that tells the ribosome which amino acid to grab next. So the codons represent, they do not become, they represent amino acids. And they've been assigned specific meanings over the course of evolutionary history. There's nothing in physics that says that GGG has to code for glycine, as is the case here. So here we've got the codon is a symbol for glycine. It is not glycine. It is not transformed into glycine. It is a symbol for glycine that the ribosome uses to, build protein. And there are different, here, this chart here, I'm showing you the standard genetic code. This is the one that our nuclear genes use, but there are actually different versions of the genetic code where different assignments have been made. So different codons, the codons will be assigned to a different amino acid, or they'll be assigned to a start or a stop function for the ribosome to obey. But there's multiple different types of genetic code. These symbols had to be assigned, and they were assigned by the process of evolution in the ancient past. So how does computer code work? Now we know how the genetic code works, but first, are there any questions, like technical questions on anything that I showed there with the genetic code that you would have, Tom?
Not yet, no.
Okay. So here I have some human-made codes next to the genetic code. So we've got artificial codes next to the natural code here. And we got Morse code. And Morse code was like the grandfather of Bodo code and then ASCII code eventually. Bodo code and ASCII code were both used in computers. And now we use slight variations of ASCII code. But the Morse code, you had commands like start and stop. So the start of a message, the end of a message. And then you had, character codes, like you have dots and dashes to represent A, B, and C. And the cool thing about this is you can send it over a wire through electric impulses. So we could transmit messages across the ocean. Bodo code works in a very similar way. You've got zeros and ones, or holes and no holes. And then ASCII code is the same, also zeros and ones. And you've got commands that are represented by these coded symbols. And you've got, in this case, letters of the alphabet that are also represented. So these symbols that the machine can read are called character code points or control code points. So these character code points here, they're coding for letters of the alphabet, so characters. But you can also have code points that code for certain controls. So in Bodo code, you've got letter and figure. So if you're currently typing letters and you want to start, or you're currently typing numbers and you want to start typing letters in your message, you have to do the letter shift command, which is 00001, and that will make the machine switch to start typing out letters instead of numbers. And ASCII code has its own controls as well. And in the genetic code, you've got stop and start as different control code points. So these code points are the symbols that the machine can read that represent something, that they act as symbols. So here in Bodo code was used originally on tape, like what we see here. And so I've got an F encoded. I'm pointing to an F in the code here. The little tiny holes in the middle are not part of the code. Those are just little gears would hold on to those and move the tape along as the machine's reading it. But the F is 01110, or blank spot, hole, blank spot. in actual tape. And here is how the machine would actually work. So you're feeding in, by the way, this is what, back when the genetic code was discovered, people were using these. This was the standard piece of equipment. If you wanted to type out a memo multiple times, you would encode that memo in Bodo code or in ASCII code, which was physically encoded into little holes in a piece of paper, a string of paper. And you would feed that through the machine, and it would tell the printer how to print out your memo. And so you could print it as many times as you wanted. And you also had computers that did this. You would write your code in holes that are punched in paper, and the machine would physically read that code. And this is how the physical machine physically reads that code. Just like a ribosome reads a chain of RNA, one codon at a time. Here we have this machine physically reading the code encoded in this piece of paper, one code point at a time. You can see I've circled there. These little metal pins push up, and those cause different switches to be switched inside the machine, and that causes a different key to be pressed, with electric magnets and motors and so on. So this, one of the things a lot of people don't get about the genetic code, they think that it doesn't count as code because it's working physically. There's physical molecules that are physically interacting with the physical ribosome. The exact same thing is true in machines. In a computer today, the physical parts, you've got transistors, but it's a little bit less intuitive when you look at a modern computer, but it really is a physical machine that's physically reading the commands. I mean, things are not magically encoded. The zeros and ones are physical switches, either switched on and off inside of a computer, these transistors. So this is how the code works. And if we look at the genetic code versus Bodo code here, we've got code points. The code point in the genetic code is a codon, and the code point in Bodo code is a series of holes. But they're both code points. It functions the same way in life as it does in our contraptions. It's a really fascinating aspect of biology. But just to end this here, Richard Dawkins pointed this out in The River Out of Eden, his book. He says, the machine code of the gene is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of molecular biology journal might be interchanged with those of a computer engineering journal.
Now I just want to give you perhaps a bonus, short bonus, and it's going to be Richard Dawkins.
If you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology, you might find a signature of some sort of designer. In biology, I suppose it would have to be the double helix, Watson and Crick discovery of the structure of DNA, which was far more than just the discovery, the crystallographic work, discovering the structure of a big molecule. Because what that led up to was a major revolution in which much of biology became a sort of branch of information technology. The consequence of the Watson-Crick discovery, with all that it led on to, the DNA code and the sort of various genome projects that are going on now, is that genes, which from my point of view are absolutely central to biology, genes are information. They are coded information. It even looks like computer information. I mean, a chromosome is a great long computer tape. It's linear, it runs one-dimensional, digital code. It's not binary, it's quaternary, but apart from that, it's just the same as computer tape. It's read in sequence. It's copied and pasted from one part of the organism to another in just the same way as a computer programmer would copy and paste. So biology has turned into computer science.
Whereas we thought that only a minority of the genome was doing something, namely that minority which actually codes for protein. And now we find that actually the majority of it's doing something. What it's doing is calling into action the protein coding genes. So you can think of the protein coding genes as being the sort of toolbox of subroutines, which is pretty much common to all mammals. I mean, all mice and men have the same number, roughly speaking, of protein coding genes, and that's always been a bit of a blow to the self-esteem of humanity. But what the point is, that was just the subroutines that are called into being. The program that's calling them into action is the rest, which had previously been written off as junk.
An individual organism is a throwaway survival machine for the self-replicating coded information which it contains. And the fate of that coded information is crucially bound up with the fate of the body in which it sits.